Hey, this is Matt Hines with DevOps TV for DevOps.com at the Does 16 conference. I'm joined by Scott Wilson from Automic. How you doing, Scott?
Doing great, thank you.
It's great to have you here. I had the pleasure of attending your session yesterday, which was DevOps fails, right, in a nutshell.
Right, the top 10 ways to fail at DevOps.
And tell us again a little bit more about number one, right? I think that was probably the one that was of most interest to everybody.
Yeah, that really got, that's why I left it for number one. That definitely generated a good discussion even after the session. On into the night, people would pull me aside and talk about it. And that was basically the case for agile ops, right? Everything DevOps, all the messaging tends to leave the operations side out of the equation, not intentionally, but just by the messaging, right? With the concept being, as I've gone to all these enterprises, that development is already agile. They have all these different agile practices, tools to accelerate, get things going fast, but that same kind of tooling and methodology and mentality is not transferred over to operations. So what tends to happen is the dev go around ops practice as opposed to dev ops practice. And there's a real need for operations, their skill set and their roles, but we need to focus on making them far more agile.
And the fail there, right, is that development becomes more agile and spins up faster releases and still just throws them over the fence to operations folks who are disempowered, and basically you've just created more agile stovepipes.
Exactly, and you wind up doing the one thing that DevOps is trying to break down. You enforce the wall, the silo, by doing this, especially if operations is using different deployment tooling or automation mechanics than development, then that definitely enforces the wall, the barrier, the silos. Exactly. So that's definitely the big fail, because operations is so busy keeping the lights on. It's one of those things, if you just don't think about what you need, then you can be in trouble. You know, the needs. You and I were talking about sports, football, before we sat down and talked, and it's a similar thing. If you got your football team, but you're not, as many teams do in the NFL, don't quite give enough credit, let's say, to the offensive line.
Right.
Then you very quickly run into problems. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, we're DevOps. We've got the fastest receiver, the best quarterback, and the fastest running back. Oh, man. And they got the worst offensive line. And they can't run the ball. The quarterback can't pass it fast enough. And they're left wondering why they struggle. They win some games, but they're not winning the big one.
Well, thankfully, at this point, I'm a Pats fan. You're a Cowboys fan. Yeah. We're both 7-1,
right.
So clearly we're very agile.
We're very agile.
Our teams
That's
are, right.
We've got agile ops,
I like
offensive line. Yeah.
Anyhow, one of the most interesting things I think you talked about, and I've referenced this already in interviews in the last couple of days, open source. Right, the whole notion of how much open source is too much open source, or when or where it gets out of control, how reliable, supportable, manageable it is. And obviously different people have different ideas. We had one of the guys from GitLab, Hayden from GitLab, was in here. I asked him the same question. And of course, they've got an interesting position, given that they come from that side of the of the world. But again, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your mindset around how organizations can manage that whole scenario in terms of how much open source you can get away with.
Yeah, excellent. That was one of my other failing points, is becoming too dependent, or at least having the expectation that you just need all open source to do DevOps, which you don't. But the big thing is some of the security failings and the do-it-yourself type effort that is required to use open source. And you really at some point got to ask yourself, well, what are you really in business to do? If you're an insurance company, well then, yes, every company is a software company, right? That's the mantra, that's the saying, and that is true, but it's also true they make their revenue from insurance, let's say, or healthcare, or whatever it may be. So if that's your primary business, do you really want to install a bunch of open source software that you now have to maintain? You have to write the glue, you have to do all the API plug work to make it all work. And then above and beyond that, once you do all that effort, you've really got to stay on top of maintaining and updating the latest libraries, because there's constantly vulnerabilities, right, that are found. And the example I gave in my session was the Heartbleed example. That like I told you in my session, that I have a friend big in open source, and his thing about the security concerns is just, hey, it's peer reviewed. Everybody can see it. You don't have to worry about these kind of malicious backdoors. And I was quick to point out the Heartbleed, because it sat out there for 2 years before it was finally discovered, and that's when it made national headlines. Meanwhile, on day 2, the NSA figured it out, and we could only assume other states did too, and were quietly, hey, did you know we can decrypt the internet?
Who knows? Right.
But yeah, so it's just something to think about. You need a good mix. The other benefit of going with a vendor is that their whole job is to make money maintaining and writing and developing and supporting you with this tool that they sell you. That you don't get that kind of support from the open source community. So I think there's a good, healthy balance that ought to be reached, trying to figure out what's the right tool and effort for the right job in the right circumstance.
It's a balancing act, right?
It is, absolutely.
And don't know where you could construe that. Either
Yeah,
by
you
saying
couldn't
don't
ask
use
me to
open
tell
source,
me.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
That's just not a practicality.
Absolutely, you ought to use it. Like I said, like I said in the session, I'm a big proponent of it. I use it myself. But if you were to also ask me, well, what's the rule of thumb? What should we this? I don't know. It depends on your company, your needs, what you're trying to get to. I mean, so many things. The skill sets, certainly. Yep.
Another one I loved: don't fail in production. You told a really entertaining yet sad story there about that CIO from Night Capital.
Night Capital.
And it's funny because later on in the day I was at another session and I heard one of the guys from GitHub, not to get pick on Git or open source or anything like that, but he's talking about, he's like, we test in production, right? And I guess hey, if you're in this world of software delivery, development, whatever you want to call it, DevOps,
right?
It's a little bit different than if you're a financial services company. But I thought that's a pretty interesting concept as we continue to encourage experimentation and learn from failing. That has its limitations too.
It does, and I'm not really a big fan of the phrase fail frequently, fail often, make it safe to fail. I tend to say it's good to fail frequently in certain environments, and it's safe to fail where it should be safe to fail, right? GitHub, sure, they can test in production, because what's the consequence if things go wrong? Right, and at Night Capital's case, or the credit card processing that perhaps Etsy runs on, it's probably not safe for them to test that component. And now Etsy doesn't own the credit card piece, right? There's another vendor, another thing, but that company, you got to believe they're not constantly testing things out in production with that system. You've got to, the circumstance. You just have to. I always say that, well, safe to fail. And again, going back to a sports analogy, my thing is this whole idea of fail frequently or making it safe to fail is saying, yeah, it should be okay to fail in the Super Bowl. I mean, that's when it's go time. That's the one time you're like, well, we don't want to fail at that point.
Well, not every game's a Super Bowl either.
Exactly.
Right? The preseason is
exactly.
different
That's what I'm
than the
saying.
playoffs.
That's why you use the Super Bowl for an example. Production is, where it's pretty important to get things right for the enterprise particularly. And a lot of my comments were geared towards the large enterprise where, given the nature of the app and your compliance or regulatory concerns, you need to change or temper the expectations a little bit when you're under those kind of constraints.
I'm going to flip it around on you
before
we let you go. So you gave your top 10 fails for DevOps. If there's one success point that you've seen, what's the hallmark of DevOps success?
The hallmark of DevOps success, it's actually going to go back to one of my fails, but I see this over and over, and even saw this in the workshops, is really getting management involved. If you can get management involved and on board with this, then you're going to be successful. If you don't, then it's kind of a grassroots. It's almost like trying to have the inmates run the asylum as opposed to getting some top-down help. And a good example for this was Heather Mickman's, not so much this talk, but if you've tracked her speeches the last 3 years, right, the real progress was made when the CIO came in, the new CIO. And up to that point, there's always these little groups that created the dojos. It was a really cool story, but they were kind of reaching this upward, my impression is anyways, this kind of
ceiling.
Yeah. And when this guy comes in, and it comes down, as I meet organizations, meet large enterprises, that's a typical story. So if you can get management buy-in, then that's a big success.
It's certainly a force multiplier, right?
It is.
I think it always starts out in pockets and typically within technology, right? And not even just management, maybe in the trenches, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well,
and sooner or later you get that conducive environment.
Exactly, and that conducive environment, as we hear a lot here, is about the culture. And I find a good way to set the tone and the culture is from leadership. If you can have all these cool things you want, if leadership isn't involved in buying into whatever that culture is, well, your leadership tends to set the tone for the culture in a lot of places, actually. And they can certainly enforce it, if not lead it.
That might take us back to our conversation about the Patriots and the Cowboys. I don't know. We won't name
Hey,
names.
what we say, every team takes the ownership onto their coach. It's kind of true. Human beings, I think, we're a bit this way. But
Sports are a great analogy for life and certainly
well,
for technology.
I will say, just to add to that one last thing, is that when I speak a lot about DevOps, I do liken DevOps to football, American football, because there are 11 people on either side. They are specialists. And if there isn't respect between each of those specialists and what there are, not everyone can be the quarterback. If everyone tries to do that, you fail, right? But there has to be a lot of coordination, communication, and they all have to do their job or you fail on any given play.
And the great leader, the quarterback or the middle linebacker, they know everybody's assignment on every play.
Absolutely. And there's also, you realize with a lot of these roles, there's a little bit of middle court, right? The difference between that lineman and that tight end, there's a point at which they blend. And I think success at DevOps is the same way. There's a lot of middle court between the roles, which lends to success, a culture of trust that everyone will do their job and contribute. And when the ball is snapped, you go. So that's why I like to use it for DevOps, because you've got a lot of different specialists. A lot of specialists can be very powerful contributors to your DevOps pipeline if they're involved and made part of that team.
Absolutely. Hopefully, barring any fumbles or additional compliance fails on the part of my team, we'll both be in the playoffs. Maybe
That's
the
right.
Super
We'll
Bowl.
see.
Yeah.
We'll
Anyways,
find it.
thanks again for joining us, Scott.
Hey, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Again, this is Matt Hines with DevOps TV for DevOps.com at Does 16. Thanks for joining us.